All right, so the heart. Everybody, I think, is familiar with where the heart is. This is a little illustration of open heart surgery, right? You cut through the sternum, you use the retractors to pull the rib cage back. You're going to have to cut through the pericardium, and then there it is. Now, we've already talked just a little bit. When we talked about general circulation here, we talked about the fact that the heart is two separate pumps, right? Right? So one side is simply the right side and the other is the left side. So there's two pumps, there's two circuits, a pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit. Let's look at the heart in a little more detail. Let's place it in its setting. The heart actually reclines on its right-hand side. This is, when we draw the heart like this, we're sort of drawing a Valentine heart. The heart doesn't sit upright in your chest like this. It sits like this, right? It lays on its right-hand side. And it sticks its point over toward the left. Now, the point of the heart here is known as the apex of the heart. Okay? And that's very, very important. When you do certain medical tests, you try and determine just where the heart is sitting in the thoracic cavity. And you should know that the pointed end of the heart is called the apex. The ventricular part of the heart is down here, and the blood vessels are all coming up out of the top. If you remember the cat, we saw superior vena cava and the aorta and all of that up here. The only blood vessel that's really down below is the inferior vena cava. The heart, you'll notice, doesn't sit right in the center of the chest either. Because it's kind of laying on its right-hand side here, most of the body of the heart is over here on the left-hand side. So when a person wants to listen to a heart, if you're going to take a stethoscope and try and listen to the heart carefully, they typically put this stethoscope over here on the left side of the rib cage. You don't want to try and listen through the bone, and you're typically going to find the fourth or fifth rib space here and put the stethoscope there, and then you're going to be able to best listen to the beating of the heart. So we first want to situate the heart in the thoracic cavity like this, pointed to the left, mostly on the left-hand side, and sort of reclining. Kind of picture somebody laying on a couch on their right-hand side, not standing upright in the chest. All right. Now, the human heart is a four-chambered heart. So we took each of these two sides, right and left, and we divided each into two pieces. We would now have the heart divided into four. And this is a very interesting thing. Why a four-chambered heart? There are animals that have two-chambered hearts. Fish have two-chambered hearts. There's animals that have three-chambered hearts. And there are animals that have four-chambered hearts. Why a four-chambered heart? It turns out that animals that need to maintain a constant temperature, what we call homeotherms. Homeo or homo is the same, hetero is different, right? So if you're going to maintain the same temperature in your body all the time, you need to be able to produce a lot of energy. And if you're going to produce a lot of energy, you need to maximize your use of oxygen. These animals over here are what we call heterotherms. These animals over here are whatever, their body is whatever temperature the environment is. If a reptile wants to get warm, they can't generate that heat in their body. They go lay on a rock in the sun. But we're able to maintain that warm-blooded state, that constant body temperature, because we're producing a lot of excess energy in our body. And that takes a lot more oxygen than it does here. And if you think about the circulatory pattern that we just saw. We saw the right side of the heart, its only job is to pump blood to the lungs, isn't it? In these, the heart pumps blood to both the lungs and the body at the same time. It doesn't have the two complete circuits that warm-blooded animals do. Birds and mammals all have four-chambered hearts, and that maximizes the amount of oxygen, and that's the only way to maintain a constant body temperature. And that's the only way to get a nervous system that works as effectively as they do in us. Okay, if you're going to want to have excellent thinking processes, you're going to need some sort of warm-blooded, some sort of constant body temperature so that the nervous system can count on certain situations, certain constitutions, certain regular environments so that the nerve cells can work the way they do. So the four-chambered heart is the key to this, maximizes the use of oxygen. Now, the image that we're going to use in our study here is this one from your textbook. Right side of the heart, left side of the heart. This is a cutaway view. This is a frontal view of the heart. You'll want to find this in your textbook. I forget what page it's on. It's in the 500s or 600s there. Next week, we've got two things that are going on. Next week, we have a practical exam. Okay, I'll talk about that more as we get toward the dissection. But you're also then later, we're going to do that on Tuesday, and then later in the week, you're going to have a quiz on the heart. Okay, and the quiz is going to look just like this. This is the simplest quiz we ever do. There's about 15 or 20 things here, and you're going to name 10 of them. So it's not like you got a list of 50 or 60 things you got to learn. This is really, really simple. Not only that, but we're going to dissect hearts today. And so when we do, we're going to be finding all of these things on the real heart that you see in the picture. So studying for the practical is going to be studying for the quiz. Right? You need to know the heart, whether you're looking at a sheep heart, a real heart, or a picture of a heart. And it's very, very simple. I'm going to show you how we work our way through here. It's not very difficult to really figure out all of the different structures and parts of the heart. Okay, so please focus on the picture that you see here. Now, what's our strategy? How are we going to do this? Well, the way to do this easily is to learn 3 groups of 4 structures. Okay, think about that. Okay, the heart structure here, because there's 4 chambers, it's based on the number 4. So here's how you do it, right? We're going to learn 3 groups of 4. 1 group of 4, then another group of 4, and then another group of 4. If you can do that, you'll have about 90% of the heart learned. There will be a few other little things you need to add to it, but you'll get most of it out of 3 groups of 4. All right? So how do we do that? Well, there are 4 chambers in the heart. And you just saw, if you divide the heart up into 4 sections, you'll see one of the chambers in each. On the right side of the heart and the left side of the heart, there is a receiving chamber. Blood that is returning to the heart from veins is going to collect into the heart. I've got a whole chamber for just collecting blood from the veins. And these 2 chambers have the same name, and we call them right and left. So there's a right atrium, and that's the one you see right here. Okay, you can see how the vena cava are connected to this, right? And so what's the one on this side called? Yeah, there's the left atrium over here. So these 2 chambers near the upper part of the heart, here's the apex down here, right? So near the upper part of the heart, up near the vessels, are the 2 chambers that receive blood. Now there are also 2 pumping chambers, and those are down here in the lower area. And the one on the right side is called the right ventricle. Okay, and the one on the left side is called, of course, the left ventricle. So it shouldn't be too difficult in any picture you're ever looking at to be able to name these 4 chambers. How are we doing? We okay with that? Okay, if we did a quiz right now and I pointed to one of these chambers, you could probably name it right now, couldn't you? Yeah. Right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. Now think, the blood coming back to the heart, the atria are always connected to veins because the blood is returning, right? Blood is returning to this side of the heart through the veins, and it collects here. The ventricles are the pumping chambers. These are the ones that squeeze. Look how thick the muscle is here. See how thick the muscle is on the walls here? These vessels, these chambers are then going to squeeze and force blood out. And of course then the arteries, like the aorta here, and the pulmonary vessels here, are all connected to the ventricles. The second set of 4 that you need to know, you're going to learn 4 chambers. There's your first set. Second set is blood vessels. There are 4 sets of blood vessels. So notice I don't say there are 4 blood vessels, but 4 sets. And basically that's kind of what I was just describing. There are blood vessels, veins coming into the right-hand side of the heart, 1 set. There are arteries going out of the right-hand side of the heart, 2 sets. There are veins coming into the left side of the heart, 3 sets. And there is an artery going out of the right-hand side, and that's number 4. Most of these blood vessels you've already named, okay, as we've studied the blood vessels in the torso, right? So, in the right atrium, right, what are the vessels connected to the right atrium? Superior and inferior vena cava. Can you easily pick those out in the picture? Right? If you know where the right atrium is, and you see 2 tubes connected to it, you know there's superior and inferior vena cava. So, we know general blood flow, right, through the pulmonary circuit, through the systemic circuit, right? Now we're going to make that more detailed because we can now follow blood flow through the heart. So I would follow blood returning from all parts of the body through the vena cava into the right atrium. Right atrium, the blood will flow to the right ventricle. Then the right ventricle will pump that blood out toward the lungs, right? And each of the tubes here is a pulmonary something. The first tube right here is the pulmonary trunk, right? Pulmonary trunk. That's the one that's leading directly away from the ventricle. In 4-chambered hearts, the pulmonary system always makes a T because there's always a right lung and a left lung, isn't there? So the pulmonary trunk is going to branch into a right pulmonary artery and a left pulmonary artery. So there are a set of 3 arteries that you should be able to name that are associated with this right side of the heart. Okay, and these are leading to the lungs, so this is part of the pulmonary circuit. Do you remember why these are blue? Are these arteries or veins? Okay, arteries. Remember, the only definition of an artery is that it leads blood away from the heart. All arteries have those layers we were just describing. Right? Never define an artery by its color. Always define it by whether it's leading away from the heart or not. The reason this is blue is, of course, because the oxygen is out at the lungs. This is the blood that is returned from the body, and I'm pumping deoxygenated blood to the lungs. The heart doesn't give it any oxygen. Color doesn't change here in the heart. I have to pump that blood out to the lungs to pick up new oxygen. Okay, so that's the right side. 2 sets, a set of veins and a set of arteries. Now the left side. Okay? The left side over here, I've got a set of veins and a set of arteries. The veins are called pulmonary veins, and these are the little ones you see here. They're going to be colored red because they're bringing oxygenated blood back from the heart, from the lungs to the heart. A blood vessel returning blood is a vein, no matter what color it is. Pulmonary veins are connected into the left atrium. And you can see these little holes right here represent the opening of these veins. And so oxygenated blood is returning to the left side of the heart. Now, if you're following blood flow, pulmonary veins, left atrium, left ventricle, and then the left ventricle pumps all of its blood out through one giant blood vessel, the aorta, aortic arch. And you know, every other systemic artery is a branch from the aorta. Branch of a branch of a branch of a branch. But basically, the heart pumps all of its oxygenated blood into the aorta and then wherever else it needs to go. So, your next question is, in your mind, if you're studying this, if you're learning this, can I name the 4 sets of blood vessels? Can I name all the veins associated with the right side? Can I name all the arteries associated with the right side? Can I name all the veins associated with the left side? Can I name all the arteries associated with the left side? Can I name the 4 chambers? Can I name the 4 sets of blood vessels? Okay? Now, I just got one more set of 4 and I'll have most of the heart done. Right? Okay, there are 4 valves in the heart also. There are 4 valves. A valve, I mentioned valves when we were discussing veins in the blood vessel lecture. Valves are one-way gates, one-way structures. They're built to allow the flow of fluid in one direction, but not in the other. They can open and they can close. They can open to let blood flow one way, but they're going to close if blood tries to back up or move the other way. They allow passage at times and prevent it at others. 4 valves. Now let's look at 2 at a time. Okay? There are valves between the chambers. So look for a valve between the atrium and the ventricle on the right-hand side. Look for a valve between the atrium and the ventricle on the left-hand side. These are called atrioventricular valves. Does that make sense? Right? The name tells you where it is. It's between the atrium and the ventricle. Now, I like to call these parachute valves. Parachute valves. Now, you know what a parachute is, right? Okay, why is this a parachute? Well, look at the structure of these 2 valves. There's one here, there's one here, right? There's a canopy, there's a membrane part of the valve, kind of like this. There are little strings. So I've got sort of a membrane, I've got some strings here. Now these are both, there's an atrioventricular valve here and there's one here. They have special names for each. Okay, the one on the right side has a name, the one on the left side has a name. So keep that straight. This is the type of valve they are. They are atrioventricular valves, both. But if I want to talk about one by itself, I'm going to give it a name. The one on the right-hand side here is called the tricuspid valve. And you'll see why the name. The name will make more sense to you in just a few minutes. This is called the tricuspid valve. The one on the left side is called the mitral valve. Mitral valve. Now, if you've taken any biology, you might have heard that that left one is called the bicuspid valve. And in some biological, when we're doing biology, we use that. But if you're going to be in medical work, 99.9% of the time when they talk about the valve on the left-hand side, they're going to use the name mitral valve. So make sure you know the term mitral valve for the left atrioventricular valve. All right? If I say name the left atrioventricular valve, right, you ought to be able to tell me it's the mitral. know what an atrioventricular valve is, and know the names of the two. Okay. So just a little bit more details. The valves we call them parachute valves because they have a canopy and they have strings. Right? The canopy is the valve itself. That's the membranous portion of the valve. The strings are called chordae tendineae. Okay? Chordae tendineae. And that's all the little strings that you see here. Right? The word cord is another word for a string, isn't it? Right? A string-like structure. And tendineae because they're also attached to little muscles. The strings are attached to the chamber walls. And if you look down where they're attached here, there are little muscles here. And you can see them over here. They're little muscles that the strings attach to. And they're called papillary muscles. So these atrioventricular valves are a little complex with the various pieces here. But all of this is necessary. So if you're pointing out an atrioventricular valve, I can show you the part I would call the valve itself. I could point out the chordae tendineae, and I could point out the papillary muscles. Anything that a string is attached to. You're going to see this in the heart today. When we dissect that heart, you're going to see these valves. It's pretty amazing. Very few people get to see the valves in a heart unless they're a surgeon or unless they dissect one. Now, the valves are not made out of whole parachutes. When we talk about the parachute structure, we're actually only talking about part. Visualize half a parachute rather than a whole parachute. Okay? And then take that part of a parachute, not even half, sometimes maybe a third of a parachute, and stitch the little cut edges along the opening between the atrium and the ventricle. If you stitch the little pieces of a parachute along here, then the parachute can open, but just part of it opens. And the parachutes always open into the center of the valve. This is where the name comes from. When I say tricuspid, what am I talking about? There's 3 little partial parachute pieces that are anchored along the edge of the opening. Over here on the mitral side, there are just 2 half parachutes over here that are stitched around the opening. So this would be the opening, and this is where it's stitched right there. Little parts of a parachute. This is why, some people call this the bicuspid, because there's just 2 cusps or 2 partial parachutes. Now the AV valves, these atrioventricular valves, allow blood to flow from the atrium to the ventricle. There's nothing to prevent that movement. Okay? As blood flows down here, it's going to flow, and the little canopies of the valves are just going to hang out there. But what happens now when the ventricles begin to pump? When this ventricle squeezes, right, and pushes, pardon me, against the blood, where's the blood going to go? When this squeezes, where's the blood going to go? There's no way out down here, right? So it's going to squeeze all the blood up this way. And you've got a picture in your textbook that helps you with this concept. Now, be aware, this is only half of the heart. Okay, the right side of the heart here is missing in this picture. We're just showing the left side here. AV valve allows blood to flow from the atrium to the ventricle. No sweat. But now what happens when the heart squeezes? Okay? Have you ever used a squeeze bottle? That's all the heart's doing. You just squeeze and it squirts. Right? So the walls here squeeze and the blood goes shooting up this way, and what happens to it here? Yeah, see how it's filling the parachutes? As the blood rushes up this way, some of it gets caught under the parachute and begins to inflate it, like air inflating a parachute. It's only part of a parachute. The cut edge is over here, but the strings over here are going to hold the edges. And as the blood comes up here, it begins to inflate. The farther and farther, the fuller and fuller it gets. Pretty soon it reaches right over, and the two parachutes or three parachutes touch each other. And the bigger they get, the more blood gets up under them, the bigger they get, the tighter they press, and they completely close this opening. Blood cannot flow back to the atrium from where it came in the first place. If it can't go into the atrium, where can it go? Yeah, out through the artery. Right? This would represent the aorta. The only way for the blood to go is out through that aorta. Okay? So the structure, this parachute nature of this valve allows blood to flow from atrium to ventricle, but prevents the blood from flowing the opposite direction. Okay, so could you name these two valves now? And do you understand how these atrioventricular valves work? Now, when you understand how they work, you can begin to understand some medical conditions related to this. Let's think of a problem here in a valve. What if, when the blood goes back in here, what if there was a leak between two of the little cusps here? What if some blood could squeeze through the valve back into here? What would happen to the pumping pressure of the heart? When the heart squeezes, if some of the blood can get back in here, what's going to happen to pressure? It's going to be less, isn't it? Not all the pressure that would normally go into the aorta will go into the aorta, will it? The pressure will be reduced because some of the blood is leaking back through the valve when it shouldn't be. I want this valve to completely seal so that every bit of pressure generated by the squeezing here is going to go out into the aorta. Leaking valves are big trouble for the heart. This is the only thing that will keep blood flowing. You can squeeze all you want, but if the valve doesn't maintain the pressure here, you're going to lose pressure going into the artery. Now, if the brain demands that you keep a certain amount of pressure out here, what's going to happen with the heart? It's going to have to beat faster, will it? Right? It's going to have, if some of the pressure is leaking out, it's going to have to pump harder to keep the right amount of pressure over here. I'm losing some pressure, so I got to work harder to keep a certain amount of pressure out in that system. So the heart, when valves are leaking, the heart begins to overwork. It begins to do way more work than it should have to because of a problem in the valve. Now, how might I know that there's a problem in the valve? What evidence might there be if there was some blood leaking out or squirting out from between some of the valves here? No, it's just going to go back to the atrium here. But yeah, that might also, that's a good point. If some of the blood's getting back in here, it might back up some of the blood that's coming from the lungs too. Depends on how much it's leaking. But that leakage can be heard, right? I can hear, if I put a stethoscope on the heart, I can actually hear the blood, because the spaces are still going to be kind of tight. So when you push something through a tight space, it typically makes a little bit of a noise. You get a little vibration in there. Right? Some sort of little noise going through there. And that's going to be heard as a heart murmur. That's exactly what a heart murmur is. It's a leaking valve. It's a leaking valve. And the tricuspid valve leaks are going to sound different than the mitral valve leaks. So cardiologists train partly by listening to recorded sounds that have been made from hearts that are leaking in certain ways. And certain sounds that they hear are going to lead them to believe that this valve or that valve is then leaking. They can tell that. So leaking valves, especially these atrioventricular valves, are big trouble for the heart. And the initial diagnosis is going to be a heart murmur. And then, of course, you're going to do an echocardiogram or some other test to then verify exactly where that leak is. If the valve is too damaged, then they may just take it out and put a whole new valve in. And that's a standard surgery today for leaking valve, is just replace them with a good valve. And you can take like valves out of other animals, the natural connective tissue valves, but they also make artificial valves with steel or plastic that they can stitch into the heart. Okay, so there's 4 valves, and we've just looked at 2 of them. These 2 are alike. Remember, they have different names, right? But these 2 are alike. Now, the other 2 valves that you see here are called semilunar valves, here and here. And these are between the ventricle and the artery that they're pumping into. Notice that these are not parachute type valves. Okay, you don't see all the strings and all of that. We've got the canopy part, but not all the rest. In these valves, I think you can see the purpose for these. If I pump, if I squeeze and force blood out into the artery, what does the heart do next? After it's squeezed, then what does it do? Then it relaxes, right? It squeezes, then it relaxes. Then it squeezes, then it relaxes. When it's squeezing, you've got pressure to force the blood out. But in the next moment, it needs to relax so that it can fill from the atrium. What do we not want to happen? I don't want that blood that I just squeezed out into the artery to come right back and fill it. This is going to be high pressure here. The next moment, there's going to be almost no pressure here. The blood would force its way back. So I need a valve to catch that. I need a valve to catch the blood I've already pumped and don't let it return. I think of these like a hip pocket valve. Right? And you can see them here, the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. We name them for the arteries they're going to go into. The right side valve is the pulmonary valve. The left side valve is the aortic valve. The blood passing through this goes into the pulmonary trunk, and the blood going into through the aortic valve is going into the aorta. So the semilunar valves are fairly easy to name. If you know the blood vessels, you'll know the name of the valve. And let's look at them in action here. Okay, and think about the pressures here. When the heart is pumping, when it's squeezing, okay, we've already described how the pressure from here shoves back against this atrioventricular valve, closes it. The pressure is very low here because this is just pumped, squeezed its blood down here. Now this is slowly filling with blood, but this is very high. This pressure is higher than the pressure in the artery. So this is going to force blood into the artery. Remember when we were talking about that? The artery, the elasticity of the artery is going to allow it to bulge. Right? I'm pumping this very high pressure into the artery. Now, in the next moment, the heart's going to relax, and what's going to happen now? The moment it relaxes, pressure drops here. Right? The high pressure out in the artery, the blood comes back against these pockets and fills the pockets. The fuller they get, the larger they get, the more they seal against one another. So they literally catch the blood. They do not allow the blood that's been pumped here to return. And so this is filled by the collected blood from the atrium. So the 2 valves here alternately open and close to keep the blood moving in one direction through the heart. And so that the heart, in its squeezing, can continue to push blood into the arteries and keep a high pressure in the arteries so that blood is continuing to flow out to the tissues. Okay? Got that? Okay, so you ought to be able to name the 4 valves in the heart then. 2 atrioventricular valves, tricuspid and mitral, and the 2 semilunar valves. This is the pulmonary valve leading into the pulmonary trunk. There's the aortic valve going into the aorta. Now, if you can do those 4 sets, or those 3 sets of 4, can I name the 4 chambers? Can I name the 4 sets of blood vessels? Can I name the 4 valves? If you can do that, you've got it mostly done. Okay? Now, just a couple of other features. There is an interventricular septum. Now, most of you should be able to dissect that word and figure out what it means, right? Interventricular is between the ventricles, and a septum, do we have an English word like that? Not septic. Separate, right? Or a separator. Why do we use the word septic for waste stuff? You know what a septic tank is? Because I want to separate that stuff from my normal everyday life, right? I want to separate it from me. It's septic. It's something that should be separated. So a septum, anywhere in the human body, a septum is a separator. You have a nasal septum in your nose, right? A wall that separates your nose into 2 passageways. So isn't that right here, is it, right? It's this right here. It's that wall between the 2 ventricles, the muscular wall between the 2 ventricles. It separates the ventricles. Now, a couple of other details with the heart. The heart has a skeleton. It's not a bony skeleton, but when you think of the heart is mostly cardiac muscle. What does that muscle hang on? What does it hold on to? Well, it holds on to the valve structure of the heart. All the valve structure here in the heart is on the same plane. You can see the 2 atrioventricular valves are here. The connective tissue runs over into the aortic valve and over into the pulmonary valve. This happens to be a posterior view. And all of the ventricular muscle then anchors into this. And all of the atrial muscle, the 2 pink circles up here, I meant to represent the atria, and the atria anchor into this. So what gives the heart sort of an internal structure that the muscle can hold on to is the connective tissues that form the valve. Now there's a second important reason for you to know this. I need you to think back on what you learned about cardiac muscle. When we did muscle, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, this might not be right at the front of your brain, but you'll recognize this. Remember, cardiac muscle cells are branched, short and branched, so that they interconnect with one another, right? So that typically if one muscle cell contracts, that contraction is spread from cell to cell to cell, and you get a holistic contraction of all the cells. So if I stimulate anywhere in here, all of the ventricular muscle is going to contract. Now, what I don't want is if the ventricular muscle contracts, I don't want the atrial muscle to contract at the same time. I don't want the muscle cells in the atrium to be connected to the muscle cells in the ventricles. I want them to contract separately and these to contract separately. So really, this connective tissue provides an electrical separator, right? So that when the atria contract, that's all they're going to do. They won't pass their signal on to the ventricles, or when the ventricles contract, they won't pass their signal on to the atria. Each one is connected separately to the connective tissue, but not to one another. So that skeleton of the heart is both a foundation and a contraction separator, an electrochemical separator. It's like an insulation between the electrical activity of the atria and the electrical activity of the ventricles. Okay. Now, when you look at, I want to take it back here. When you look at this picture, you look at the valves, and they're not all on the same plane in this picture, right? You can see the two atrioventricular valves and this valve seem to be here, but they've drawn the aortic valve way up here. In reality, this valve is right down here. All the valves are on the same plane, forming the skeleton of the heart. The only reason they drew this up here is so you could see it. If they had drawn it in its normal position, it would have been right behind here, and you would not be able to see it. So when you look at this picture, don't think the aortic valve is way up here. It's right down here. And some textbooks, in fact, I'm going to give you a lab activity today that we're going to work on in class, and they draw the valve right down here, but you can only see part of it because it's partially hidden. So there's different ways to draw this, but I just wanted you to be aware that when you look at a picture like this, this really shows the reality that all of the valves are in the same plane, on the same level in the heart. Now there's something else that you should know about the heart too. When you look at a right ventricle and left ventricle, right atrium, left atrium, you get the idea that the heart is sort of a 50-50 thing. Kind of like, if you remember what we just talked about with the blood in the arteries and the blood in the veins. That's not so true. And you can see this if you take and cut across the heart this way. Right? Cut it like this. Right? Cut across the heart this way. This is the left ventricle. This is the right ventricle. See how different they are? The sort of frontal view kind of makes them look the same, but they look very different here. Is this heart mostly right ventricle or mostly left ventricle? It's mostly left, isn't it? And look how thick the muscle here is in the left ventricle. The right ventricle seems to be just sort of like a pocket attached to the left ventricle. And the muscular wall here seems to be a lot thinner. Now, can you think why that would be? Why would the left ventricle have so much muscle and be so much bigger? Big hollow chamber here. What does the left ventricle do versus what the right ventricle does? Where does the left ventricle pump and where does the right ventricle pump? Yeah. The left ventricle is pumping to the entire human body, isn't it? This is the systemic circuit. Right? This is pumping blood up to the top of my head, out to my fingertips, down to my feet, to every major organ in my body. Where's the right side pumping to? Yeah, just next door, right? How much work is it to pump blood just right next door and back? Not much, right? But to get all the blood out to every other tissue in my human body is a huge task. So the heart is really a left ventricle, right? With a right ventricle attached so that you can get blood to the lungs. Now that's not to negate this. The right side is critically important. If you don't go to the lungs to pick up oxygen, then you got nothing to deliver. And anything that doesn't work here backs up the entire system. Because it's a continuous circuit, any place that blood backs up, it affects everything else. But you should know this. You're going to see this when we open the heart today. I want you to make note of when we cut through the ventricle wall on the right and the ventricle wall on the left, note the difference in the size. You're going to literally see this in the heart. Okay? One last thing that we need to look at related to the internal structure of the heart here, and that is the major tissues. There's 3 major tissues associated with the heart that you should know. The heart is mostly cardiac muscle. Mostly cardiac muscle. Cardiac muscle is called myocardium. This is the general name for the muscle of the heart, the cardiac muscle of the heart. You will hear this word used with some disease states. Right? Anybody know what the technical name is for a heart attack? A myocardial infarction. A myocardial infarction. And what that's telling me, when somebody says that, that's telling me that there's something wrong with the heart muscle itself, the myocardium. That's the tissue name for the cardiac muscle of the heart. Now, the other two tissues that are here are aligning on the inside of the heart. Right? Guess which of those two words is the inside lining? It's got to be endo, right? Endo, inside. So all of this cardiac muscle is covered with an epithelial membrane. Very slick. I don't want the rough connective tissue and the muscle here. I don't want the rough surface of that coagulating blood. So all of the inside of the heart, every valve, every surface, every bit of muscle is covered with a slick membrane called the endocardium. This is exactly the same stuff as the endothelium of the blood vessels. Right? Remember, every blood vessel has an inner lining, very slick, very smooth. We call it the endothelium. Endothelium and endocardium are exactly the same thing. It's just if I find it in the heart, I call it endocardium. If I find it in a blood vessel, I call it endothelium. But it's the same exact tissue. Meaning that it doesn't matter what blood touches anywhere in the cardiovascular system. If it's in contact with a wall, it's touching endocardium or endothelium. It provides a very slick, smooth surface so that platelets don't break and so that the blood does not begin to coagulate in the blood vessels. Now, there's also an external layer of tissue that protects the heart from friction. You know that as the visceral pericardium. Right? The visceral pericardium is the outer epithelial tissue, the serous membrane that protects the heart from rubbing against anything else. Typically, when the heart is all by itself, if we have the pericardial sac, we'll refer to the two parts of the pericardium. But if we have the heart by itself, all alone, with no sac around it, we'll typically call that outer membrane the epicardium. So that it's endocardium, myocardium, epicardium. But these two things are the same thing. Two different names for the same exact thing. Okay? Now, this is one of the things that I would include in the quiz. If we look at this picture, if this is the picture you're going to see in the quiz, like this, right? I can be pointing to a valve. I can be pointing to a chamber. If I point down here to the tissue here, if the line is pointing in here at the muscle, you're going to call it the, if it's pointing into the muscle tissue, you're going to call it the myocardium. If the line is just pointing to the very outside edge, you're going to call it the epicardium. And if the line would go in so it's just pointing to the inside lining here, then you're going to call it endocardium, right? So make sure that you can identify, if you think back through it now, make sure you can identify the four chambers, four sets of blood vessels, right? Make sure you can name the four valves. You should know the interventricular septum, right? You should know the chordae tendineae and the papillary muscles of the atrioventricular valves. And then you should be able to name the three tissue layers within the structure of the heart. Everybody good with that? Okay.